Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. Today, we're going to talk about leveraging the power of Linux on Windows, how to deploy and use Windows Subsystem for Linux. So Windows Subsystem for Linux it's an optional feature that was added in Windows 10 and really polished by Windows 11 that provides you with a seamless integration to run Linux, a Linux instance on Windows. It gives you the command line tools and the applications that you're familiar with. These run directly on Windows without the traditional virtual machine or a dual boot configuration. The purpose of WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, is to bridge the gap between Windows and Linux environments, enabling developers, sysadmins, and end users, and so on, to leverage the power of both operating systems simultaneously. With WSL, users can access a wide range of Linux software, the development tools that you'd be familiar with, all your scripting languages and package managers that aren't really available or you're not familiar with on Windows. You can take advantage of a familiar workflow and allows developers to test and build cross-platform applications with ease, providing a familiar Linux environment without sacrificing the productivity and compatibility of Windows. This is, I'd say, the biggest reason to use Windows Subsystem for Linux is familiarity, in that because the systems that we have are Linux-based, it's easier to use Linux on your home computer or on your terminal access than it is to use raw Windows. It'll be compatible with all of our instructions. Now, before WSL support was added, there was plenty of other options, and most of which are still completely valid. Users used to rely heavily on virtualization tools like VMware or VirtualBox, or even dual booting their computer in order to get a full Linux environment. There is other options as well. So while you could do a full dual boot or you could do a VM, as we see, let me bring my pointer up here. In that range, what I consider more of a hardware-based solution. So VM, a virtual machine, would run on your computer, but run in its own isolated environment. Whereas a dual boot is you start up on a completely separate operating system altogether. And that's what I used when I was in school, and it was a pain. Then I switched to Cygwin, which is a software-based solution. It doesn't actually run a Linux environment. What it does is a bunch of executables, a bunch of programs that are used in order to mimic Linux. And it does a pretty good job to a point, because it's still not an actual Linux environment. MOBA Xterm is a wrapper on Cygwin that gives you a nice visual environment and terminal in order to emulate the Linux environment. So we've got the software-based solutions, we have hardware-based solutions, and in the middle, we have Windows Subsystem for Linux. And what Windows has done is they've created their own kernel, so it's not your normal, it's based on the open source Linux kernel, but they made a kernel so that they can make a compatibility between Windows and Linux that you don't have on a purely software or purely hardware-based solution. So WSL offers two versions known as 1 and 2, WSL 1 and WSL 2. WSL 1 utilizes a compatibility layer, which we'll go into a bit more detail in a moment, to translate system calls, whereas WSL 2 introduces a full-fledged Linux kernel. So we will move on to the next. We'll describe these two here, the two different architectures that we use. So the original, and they're both used still. WSL1 was obviously the first version of WSL, whereas WSL2 is a more modern one. Both are still used, and there's reasons to use one and reasons to use another. WSL1 uses API calls that are converted to and from Windows API. So you've got a translation layer. So when you do something in Linux, it translates it to a Windows API call and then returns the results. Problem with this, of course, not all API calls are implemented, and it's still not running a true Linux kernel. It's running the distro in Linux, in Windows. Whereas the WSL2 architecture, now taking advantage of the hypervisor or Hyper-V, is smaller, smarter, but slightly larger implementation. So Windows managed VM will then, so essentially Windows itself is running on the hypervisor almost as a VM itself. And so is Linux running its own kernel in this case. So that when you when you're in the Linux mode, you're actually running Linux and you do an API call, you're actually calling an actual Linux API call, as opposed to running it through the translation layer. So while WSL2 uses Microsoft's Hyper-V as a hypervisor under the hood, modern CPUs have their own hypervisor to run the utility VM. It doesn't require you to enable Windows Hyper-V role or features. WSL works perfectly fine without it. But that's mostly neither here nor there for you, although I will show you how to detect whether or not you're running hypervisor on your CPU. Now remember that WSL is not a full replacement or for a traditional VM. With the help of hypervisor, the traditional VM creates, whereas a traditional VM creates an isolated environment in your host system, WSL2 acts as a separate virtual computer with all the hardware components that you have, but it still allows you, it's not actually isolated from Windows, and it allows you a lot of communication back and forth. Most namely would be the Windows file system, which will show how easy it is to access Windows files from Linux. So it's important to note that while there are specific use cases where you might want to use WSL1, WSL2 is generally offers better performance and improved compatibility, and it's running an actual Linux environment as opposed to translated API calls. Microsoft actively encourages people to upgrade to WSL2, and if you're starting from fresh, that's the version you should use, as it's definitely a more sleek experience. One of the reasons you might not want to use it is lack of compatibility. Now, most people are compatible now. Anyone with Windows 11 is going to be able to easily install and run WSL. And Windows 10 at a certain build, so version 1903, with build 18362, you can look that up in your system settings, are required to run WSL. Now, by default, WSL uses half your memory and half your CPU cores, or sorry, has access to half your memory and half your CPU cores. This, however, you can fine tune if you want to limit your instances to a certain amount, or if you want to let your instances have access to a lot more. Now, to say that it has access to half the memory as opposed to it uses half the memory, when you start up WSL, it doesn't just hog all its memory. It just says, I have access to half the memory in your system. So unless you actually run a program that uses it, your regular Windows operating system will still have access to that memory. It's recommended you have about 1 to 2 gigabytes of disk space. It runs on a virtual drive, a virtual hard drive, which we'll see when we install one, that it's actually just physically a file on your system. This drive takes up about a gig or so, depending on how much files you have in there. It's also recommended that you have about 4 gigabytes of RAM for a smooth experience. It's not a hard limit, but it's just going to make things, because you are running 2 operating systems on the same pool of memory at the same time, the more RAM you have, the better it's going to run. Your CPU must support hardware virtualization features. Most modern CPUs do. It's not much of a problem. Now I'm going to open up PowerShell here. Now, if you want to get the PowerShell, you just go down to your Windows programs here and just type PowerShell. You've got the default Windows PowerShell. I've downloaded and installed PowerShell 7. It just gives you a number of Linux commands that are built in, like SSH and so on and so forth, ls instead of directory. Just because I switch back and forth so much, I tend to forget where I am. So we're in PowerShell now. And we're just going to go with system info so we can see what's on my system. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, the name of your computer, what versions you are, the build number. So we saw the build before. You have to have a certain build if you're doing Windows 10, Windows 11. It doesn't matter. They're all compatible. The amount of memory, we got 32. We're fine. So on and so forth. And down here is your Hyper-V requirements that we're talking about. Most modern CPUs have it, but you can just take a look and see if your hypervisor is being detected. So the features for Hyper-V won't be displayed because it doesn't need it. So the requirements are actually fairly light, in my opinion, for modern computers. The only problems we've really run into in the past is if somebody's using a laptop where their particular institution has not permitted them to upgrade their Windows, which honestly is a security problem all on its own. So hopefully if you're using a computer of your own at home, you'll have an up-to-date Windows just for security purposes alone, and that will allow you to run Windows Subsystem for Linux. So we're going to go through a lot of these commands in much more detail as I move on, but I'm just going to do a quick little overview of the commands on how to run Windows Subsystem for Linux. So WSL is the program name. WSL commands, so there's a series of -- commands. List is probably the one you're going to use the most. It's going to show you which distros you have installed. Use list with verbose, give you more information. If you want to start, so if you have multiple distros installed, so you can have multiple versions of Linux installed at the same time, even running at the same time, you can start it with a -D and specify your distro command. Set default, the one that starts up automatically when you ask it to. Install, so this is a kind of a two-part command, and we'll cover that. So first is it will install WSL onto your system automatically for you. And I can't really demo that today because I've already done it. But it's literally you type in WSL -- install in PowerShell, it'll install. You'll have to reboot. Rebooting doesn't work very well for online presentations, which is why we're skipping it. And the second part of using WSL install is to install the actual distro onto your computer. Shutdowns all the currently running distros. Unregister will remove a distribution from WSL. It's no longer one you've installed. It will basically uninstall it. Export creates a tarball in order to save a backup of your distro, and import obviously unbackups your distro. Set version, if you've got a previous version that you've used, you may want to change it from version 1 to version 2. You use the set version command, or if you've previously installed WSL 1 on your computer, you can upgrade it with WSL set version default, and of course the -- help. So just to drive it home, it is literally just WSL. I've got no distros installed right now. I'm on a login where I've removed all my distros so I don't accidentally destroy my important ones that I use every day. WSL -- help -- help, and here's just a list of your basic commands and what they do. There's a lot here, but it's not really all that difficult. All that. It's a lot more than you need, I suppose. So WSL -- install is what you'll type to install the actual distribution, and it will give you it'll install a virtual machine platform. Once it's installed, it'll then install the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And it will ask you to reboot your computer. If you want to reboot from the command line, you can use restart computer -force, and that will just restart your computer. For those of you who have not got an upgraded version, or you need to do this manually, our YouTube channel, sharknet.youtube.ca, does have a 2-minute video on how to install WSL manually that we made before. They made this very streamlined install. It used to be you'd have to enable the Windows Subsystem for Linux and then go download the distro manually, and so on and so forth. WSL -- install makes things so much easier. Now we will just go and we will install a distro. So that's the very first thing you do. And after you've done that, you will move on to, if you've done it before, or you've installed WSL at a previous date, you should always just update it. That's good for really anything. So we'll just update mine. It should be updated now. There's been an update since yesterday. So this is the most recent version has been installed. If it's not, it'll just do the update for you and away you go. Just as a side note, so I've got all these slides which will be posted online, and I've put the commands in there mostly so that you can read the slides without having to watch the presentation if you just need to know what the commands are. So you can set the version of the, but I guess we're putting the cart before the horse there because I haven't actually installed a distro. If I go www-install, it's going to install the default distro. So what I really want to do is I want to see what's available to install. So we will go, let's go with a set default version. So this is what I was talking about before. If you just installed it, it should already be, the default version should be set to 2. You set it to 1 with that, set it back to 1, set it back to 2. Fairly trivial. Gives you a little link if you want to go and see what the real differences are in detail, much more detail than I provided. I just usually leave it at 2. And we're going to list the distros available. So WSL -- list. Now, list by itself would normally just show you the distros that you have. But if you add an online flag in there, these are the distros that are available by default. So you've got the big ones, Ubuntu Debian, you got Kali, a couple of different versions of Ubuntu, Oracle Linux, SUSE, and so on. Now you can also go in, so we're going to go WSL install Ubuntu, and that will just give us the default Ubuntu image there. It doesn't really take a few minutes. Every time I've done this, just takes a couple of seconds. There we go. Now, anybody who's installed Linux on a VM or on the dual boot is going to be familiar with this. And it's just going to ask you for your basic information, like your username. We'll put in my username, super secret password. And now it's just going to set up Linux. So right now, we've already got WSL installed. Now we're just installing a flavor of Linux in WSL. There it is. Now it's done. So now we've got a prompt. And if you take a look at the notes or the slides, you'll notice that I've tried to differentiate the prompts with a C:/ and a $sign symbol in order to differentiate where the different commands are going. Because now we'll be hopping back and forth a little bit between Linux and Windows. And it's as simple as that. So we've now installed it. You can exit just with exit. And now we're back in Windows. If we do WSL list now, we'll see that we now have a system, whereas a second ago we didn't. And it's marked as default. That means if we just type WSL, Ubuntu will start. Now you notice how quickly it started that time. So we're going to go -- verbose, which will give you that. We can abbreviate that to -L-V, and we're just going to sit here and wait. They call it the 8-second rule. In practice, it takes more than 8 seconds. If you exit the WSL instance and you're trying to make changes to something, it actually takes about 8 to 10 seconds for the instance to shut down. So now it has actually stopped. If we do WSL, it'll start up again. So we're just going to update. So obviously the sudo apt update my super secret password. First thing you should always do with your new Linux instances is update and upgrade. And this just gets everything up to date. As it'll be at whatever Windows image has uploaded for you. This just takes a second. As an aside here, I'm just going to list for those who are, so there's a set default version, list online. So selecting a distribution, your major distributions, I would say, would be your Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, and CentOS. There was a couple of others in there. And there are hundreds of Linux distributions available. It's not always apparent necessarily which one your requirements that you need. Some of you will be IT experts, and this is all moot to you. You know what you want, but some of you are hard science experts like biology or physics, or some of you are humanities experts, and you might want to have a different distribution based on what you're doing. I will often default, you'll notice, to Debian or Ubuntu only because of familiarity. I recognize the apt package system a lot easier than I do with CentOS and Fedora. And Debian is well known for its stability and extensive package repositories. It's a versatile distribution that works well for your desktop and your server environments. It's a good default one. Ubuntu being a flavor of Debian, I remember it was originally marketed as your user-friendly, here's Linux that everyone can use. While in practice now, all modern Linux versions everyone can use. It's probably one of the most widely used Linux distributions, user-friendly, highly customizable environment, suitable for people who are new to Linux. It's easy to use and comes with a lot of software development tools. Fedora is a community-driven distribution, sponsored by Red Hat, and it offers a cutting-edge, up-to-date software stack, making it suitable for developers who are looking for the most recent features. CentOS you might want to. Actually, I don't think CentOS was on the list, but I want to mention it anyways, because we use CentOS on our clusters. So if you want an environment that's exactly the same, you might want to look into CentOS. It focuses on stability, security, and long-term support, which is why it's very popular for server deployment. So that's a little sidebar. Now we're going to go back to our terminal. I'll exit here. Where are we? ls minus l minus v. Now note, WSL minus l minus v. If you go WSL minus v minus l, it means something completely different. Minus v gives you the version, in which case it ignores the -l flag. So if you want to know what version you're running, it's a little bit of information there. We're going to look at our list. So we've when we do WSL minus L minus V, you notice the default minus L. Sorry, we'll show you the default. If we're going to install a second version, just to show you multiple, so we're going to install Debian right next to it. Now the big problem is that once you've installed, this is, in my opinion, a bit of a shortcoming. Once you've installed Ubuntu, you can't actually install a second Ubuntu easily. You have to have a different flavor each time. There is a workaround, but first of all, we're going to do, that's why I'm going to do WSL -- install, and this time we're going to go with Debian. Take a second, same things we just went through. Installing may take a few minutes. There we go, same stuff we did before. Password. Oop. Put the password in wrong. There we go. And now we're on Debian, so I have to touch Debian. So there's a file there. WSL-L-V. There's two versions. We want to get back into Ubuntu. We can specify it with the -d flag. You'll notice I'm in my C drive, I guess, if we go home. I am Ubuntu. That's a different file there, right? We can go right back to Debian, as we just did with Ubuntu, just to be pedantic. I am Debian. Two different instances running at the same time. Now, they will both die now that we've exited the last user. They will eventually shut down, so Ubuntu has shut down and Debian will. If you open it up in a different terminal, of course, it will stay running. So there is the shutdown command, WSL -- shutdown, and it will just shut down everything. So everything that's running will be stopped. Keep in mind that if you have it open in a different terminal and you're running something, it will kill all the processes, just shut it down. It's good if you ever get into a state that something's happening, you just got to kill it. Or if you're doing updates and you just don't want to wait the 8 seconds, you often just hit the shutdown and then change some setting in WSL. Well, now that we've installed Debian and Ubuntu, I did mention briefly that you can't actually install a second Ubuntu with the same command. What we can do is we can create, oh, it's still running. Why is that running? Interesting. What we can do is we can create a backup image, a tarball of our instance. And we'll use that with the export command. Well, this is what WSL-export. And we're going to name the what we want to. So it's Ubuntu that we want to create the image for. And we're going to give it a name. We're going to call it Ubuntu.tar because, well, it says it's a tarball. So I'll take them at their word. Again, this may take a few minutes, and you're going to get an idea of how big these images are. They run around 1 gig by default. Oh, that's pretty quick. So now we have a 1.3 gigabyte file for the Ubuntu tarball. We can put that, save it somewhere. If you want to, you can use tar, create verbose, compress, say the file. Because they are quite large, you might not want to just have them sitting around. GZ and Ubuntu.tar. And that will just create an archive. That's slightly smaller. I think it runs in about half the size, maybe not. We'll let it work for a second. This will just compress your tarball down a bit if you want to store it for long term. So this is just a good way of creating an image or a snapshot of your instance if you're going to be going and mucking around about this stuff. I'm not going to sit here and wait for that to happen, so we're just going to remove tar.gz. Now the big thing is we can, now you want to be able to restore it, obviously. Your location for these files, these virtual hard drives, are in your user directory. And we're not going to place the new one there. We're going to place the current one in our current directory here. Just my WSL user. We'll make a temp directory. The tar to the temp. This is just so we can just kind of, you can see what's going on here. So we're going to go WSL import. We might have to run this as an administrator, actually, now that I mentioned that. Well, let's go through the import without the admin privileges. So it's import, and then the name of the instance that we want. So we're going to just call it Ubuntu 2. The location we want to put the virtual hard drive, we're just going to put it right here. And then, of course, the source image, Ubuntu.tar. Import and progress. This may take a few minutes. Did not. We go ls. So this is what I wanted to show you. So now we have our original image, and it has created a virtual hard drive here. And that's what's going to launch when we actually run Ubuntu 2. The virtual hard drives do exist for the other images. They are stored elsewhere. So we will go WSL minus list minus verbose, and we'll now see that there's a third image, and that's Ubuntu 2. If we go WSL-D 2, it's going to launch up. Now, you're going to notice a bit of a difference here in that we are logged in as root instead of user in this case, because we restored it from a tarball. If we want to change that, which we often do, you want to set your default user. There is a file called etc. So in is WSL.conf for configuration file. There's not much in there right now. It's just telling us to use system D. And in here is where you can set things that tell it what kind of memory to use, how many core limits, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're going to do is we're going to tell it who we want the default user to be. So we're just going to put in a command here just to make it behave the same way as the original. and it is just user default. Is the login name that I provided, which was my name. Quit, exit. Now, in this case, we're going to shut everything down because it doesn't take effect until they actually start up a new instance. 2, and we should be me. There we are. Now we're me. And of course, if we go home, you'll see the Ubuntu file that I created before. We'll create another file called im2, right? And this is just to show you that we are indeed running 2 different instances. And of course, I'm Ubuntu. So they are 2 different instances running on 2 different virtual hard drives. And that is the best way if you want to run multiple things, you want to try a bunch of different settings, create an export, create a tarball, and import it as separate distributions. Now, most of my presentations often run way more than my 45-minute limit. So I've got a couple of little demos here because I've got time to do so. And we're just going to show you some of the things that you can do with it. This is well, these 2 items are by and far not an exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea. So one thing, and I saw this come up in a ticket a little bit ago, was WSL and remote desktop. And if you want to run remote desktop, instead of going through the Windows version where you have to go and find the program and run it, it's much easier just to install it directly in WSL and run it from there. So let's open up our terminal and have a look. So it's make sure, who am I in? What am I in? Yeah, I'm in Ubuntu. So just install it, sudo apt-get install Tiger VNC -viewer. Oh, super secret password. Yep. Now, as simple as that, we're just going to go with VNC viewer, gravdi.compute, Canada correctly.ca. And now it's opened up over here. So because, and this is the advantage of it being in Windows, as opposed to a translation layer, is here we are. And now I'm in, now we are logging into the VDI cluster. I don't have my password fully memorized. Ooh, where are we? Let me just get my, the system would like to know, I have a very long and convoluted password for this. Great. Oh, what happened there? There we go. Is it not cooperating? Oh, there we go. Just a little bit slow right now. And there we are. So now we're on, while we're on the clusters, right? So now if I open up a terminal here, so now I've got a terminal in a terminal running over Tiger. And now we're in Grand VDI. So if you need to run a graphical program on the clusters, away you go. That's one way of doing it. We just close it down. Handy, now that we've done that, if you do Tiger VNC, I don't know, I can't really zoom in here. I apologize for that. But that says Tiger VNC viewer, and it's got a little brackets around it, Ubuntu. So we can actually launch the Ubuntu program from Windows. And then you'll recognize this if you use Tiger VNC. Another thing you can do, now they don't recommend doing this. Oh, sorry, that would be VS Code. So this is running a browser. There's no real reason to run a browser. It's just more a demonstration of some of the things that we can do with WSL. I've lost my PowerPoint. There we go. So the next point, there we go, browser. So you'll install the package by hand here. So it's not really by default, but we will want to get the slides, so I just copy and paste that, but I've lost my slide page being covered up by Zoom. There we go. I'm not one for typing things correctly the first time. So we're just going to copy and paste that to here. There we go. And then we install the package. It says errors, so we can fix that pretty easily. The user commands, for the record, are on the slides. I'm just copying and pasting them from there. And now we should be able to go with Google. See if she works. Again, this is not necessarily something you would do. I typed that correctly. Let me. Oh, I didn't do the fix, did I? Ah, get back here. There we go. It's broken. The details of which are not really necessary, but what it's doing is just fixing the packages so they work. And actually took longer, if you asked me to do this, than it did to actually install the image. And now we get Chrome. It shows up over here. Boop. Telling you stuff. So it's default browser. This isn't your Windows. We don't care about any of that. And there we go. Now we've got a browser running in WSL. The only real advantage of doing this, and it occurred to me, it happened to me once, is where we wanted to install something that had an online only installer. Really weird. But if we take a look at this, you'll notice that this is now the file system of WSL. If we look in home, Edward, you'll see the I am Ubuntu file that I made. And there we are. I can zoom in. Oh, I can zoom in here. And that is in Chrome. So as a side note, one of the handy compatibilities, we're just going to talk about the file system real quick. I've got a bit more time. And so I'm just opening up, this is just my Windows file system. Can't really zoom in. You'll notice on the left here, you've got your regular CD drive. Oh, my camera card is in there at the moment. And there's also Linux way down here. And there are your 3 file systems for the 3 installations. So it's actually really easy to go in and manipulate files. So if we go to Ubuntu, the one I've currently got open, home, Edward, the I am Ubuntu file, I'm just going to delete it. It's gone. And go back to here, go home, ls, it's gone. Touch, I'm back. And that'll be back, right? So it just makes it really easy to manipulate files. Might have to reload that. There we go, I'm back. Back and forth and transfer them to and from your images. I like it. You just copy it over to the correct drive. If you've got files on your Windows system that say you want to upload to the cluster, you've always got the mount directory. And you can file directory C, file directory C, and that's our C drive, right? So we go into users, YM, permission denied. But anyways, so there's a D drive, we've got files, and you can access the files from your Windows drive directly on your Windows Subsystem for Linux instance. The one last thing we'll show is a popular program is VS Code, and a lot of people like to use VS Code to code in. Now you can install VS Code in Windows Subsystem for Linux, but they even print up a warning. They say don't do that. Install VS Code in Windows, Visual Studio Code, which I've already installed. It's here. And if you have that, you can go over here. You see this little extensions button over on the left. If I could zoom in somehow, I would. And you click on that, and what you want to do is you want to install the dev containers collection, so remote development. If you just look for remote development pack, and just, it'll show up, and there it is. There's at the top. Install that. It's already installed here. And what that gives you is this little button down here is called the Remote Explorer. And if you click on that, you'll see, again, very small. You'll see that there's a Debian, an Ubuntu, and Ubuntu 2. And we'll click that, just double click it. Oh, not double clicking. I guess we'll just do this little plus thing over there. And it opens up a new version of, or a new instance of Visual Studio Code. And if we now open up a file here, you go open folder, this is the file system on Ubuntu. So you can do your development in WSL, but have the IDE running on Windows. I personally find it very handy because oftentimes the IDE itself runs better on Windows, but the actual development tools and development environment is much nicer in Linux. And you can do both now. I will now take any questions.